Chicago, 1930. 59 bullets ripped through the body of a man on a quiet street corner, and when the smoke clears, the newspapers won't even bother asking who ordered it, because everyone already knows. This is the man Al Capone feared more than any other. Not because he was the strongest. Not because he had the biggest army. But because he simply would not stop coming. He survived ambush after ambush, betrayal after betrayal, and every single time the underworld thought he was finished, he came back sharper, angrier, and more dangerous than before. Tonight, we tell the story of the boss who refused to kneel, the man they called Joe Aiello. Before we descend into the blood-soaked streets of Prohibition-era Chicago, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now wherever you are. Are you riding home after a long shift, lying in bed with the lights off, or sneaking in an episode on your lunch break? Drop it below, we want to know who's walking into the shadows with us tonight. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to drag the forgotten kings of the underworld out of the dark and put their real stories back in front of you. Now, let's begin. Before there was blood on Chicago's sidewalks, before there was a name whispered in fear in every speakeasy from the Loop to Little Italy, there was a boy standing on a dock in New York Harbor with saltwater still drying on his coat, looking up at a city that didn't know his name yet and wouldn't care if it did. It was the summer of 1907. Joe Aiello was 17 years old, a farmer's son from a town called Bagheria, a sun-bleached little settlement of orange groves and stone villas perched on the northern coast of Sicily, not far from Palermo. He had crossed an ocean the way thousands of young Sicilian men crossed it in those years, packed below deck, seasick, hungry, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the address of relatives who were supposed to be waiting for him on the other side. Nobody watching him step off that boat could have imagined what he would become. There was no omen in the air, no dark portent hanging over the tenements of the Lower East Side to warn the world that this particular immigrant boy would one day be feared by the most powerful gangster in American history. He was just one face in an endless river of faces, one more name on a manifest, one more son of Sicily hoping that America would give him something his home country couldn't. But that is exactly how it always starts, isn't it? The men who come to rule empires of blood rarely announce themselves at the beginning. They arrive quietly. They work. They wait. And somewhere in the waiting, something hardens inside them, a hunger, a grievance, a refusal to ever again be small. Joe's father was Carlo Aiello, a modest fruit merchant back in the old country, a man who had scraped together a living the honest way, selling produce in the markets of Bagheria and hoping his sons would do the same, or better. Joe's mother had died when he was still a boy, and in the world he came from, a boy who lost his mother young learned early that life did not owe him gentleness. He learned to survive on his own instincts, to read a room, to know which men could be trusted and which men were only waiting for the moment your back was turned. It is a lesson that would serve him, and haunt him, for the rest of his life. When Joe arrived in America, he didn't go to Chicago. Not yet. He went upstate, to a place called Utica, New York, a gritty industrial town wedged along the Mohawk River, roughly halfway between the Great Lakes and the state capital in Albany. Two of his older brothers, Nunzio and Andrea, were already there, having made the crossing before him, and like so many immigrant families of that era, the Aiellos followed a chain, one brother sending word back to the others that there was work, there was a room to share, there was a life to be built brick by brick in a country that didn't always want them but couldn't survive without their labor. Utica in those years was a magnet for Sicilian immigrants. Factories needed hands. Foundries needed men willing to do backbreaking work for wages that would have seemed like a fortune back in Bagheria but were barely enough to survive on in America. Joe and his brothers found work molding pipe in one of the local foundries, standing over molten metal in the heat and the noise, day after day, year after year, doing the kind of labor that ages a man twice as fast as the calendar does. By 1910, census records show 4 Aiello brothers packed into a single Utica boarding house, sharing what little they had, sending money home when they could, trying to carve out something resembling stability in a country that saw them as cheap, disposable muscle. It would have been so easy for Joe Aiello to disappear into that life entirely. Thousands of men just like him did, they worked the foundries, they married, they raised children, they grew old and died forgotten, footnotes in the great unwritten history of American immigration. And for a while, it looked like that might be exactly where Joe was headed. He married a young woman named Caterina Amara, a fellow native of Bagheria, possibly even a cousin. The immigrant world was small, and Sicilian families in America tended to marry within their own tight circles, preserving old-world ties across an ocean of distance. Together, Joe and Caterina began building a family. Their first child, a daughter named Lena, was born around 1917 or 1918. A son, Carlo, followed in 1919, named for Joe's father. More children would come after, Anthony, Catherine, another Joseph. On the surface, it was the story every immigrant family wanted for itself. Hard work. A growing household. A little business here and there. The Aiello brothers eventually built up a bakery, and it did well enough that people would later remember it as one of the more successful ventures in the neighborhood. There were grocery interests too, imports of olive oil, cheese, sugar, legitimate trade goods that Sicilian merchants had dealt in for generations, transplanted now into the American economy. But underneath that surface, something else was stirring. Because Utica, like so many industrial towns that drew heavy Sicilian immigration in that era, already had its own underworld, a network of older, established criminal associations, brought over from Sicily along with the language and the food and the customs, quietly operating in parallel to the legitimate immigrant community. And Joe Aiello, whatever gentler path his father might have hoped for him, was drawn to it. Maybe it was ambition. Maybe it was the simple mathematics of Prohibition-era economics, where a man who controlled liquor could make in a week what a foundry worker made in a year. Maybe it was something colder and more personal, a need, buried since childhood, to never again be the powerless one in the room. Whatever it was, by the middle of the 1910s, Joe Aiello's name had already begun appearing in places it shouldn't have. In 1917, he was suspected in a shooting in East Utica, a man named Antonio Gagliano wounded in an incident that had all the hallmarks of underworld business gone wrong, and in one of the recurring patterns that would define Aiello's entire career, the case against him collapsed. The victim, when brought before a court, refused to identify his attacker, later claiming police had forced a statement out of him at gunpoint. It's a small story, easy to miss in the broader arc of Aiello's life, but it tells you something important about the man at the very beginning of his criminal career. He was already learning how the machinery worked. He was already learning that violence, handled correctly, did not have to end in a courtroom. He was already learning the code of silence that would define, and eventually claim the lives of, an entire generation of men like him. There was tragedy mixed in with the ambition, too, and it's worth pausing on it, because the men who become legends in the history of organized crime are so often flattened by the stories told about them, reduced to a name, a body count, a headline. But Joe Aiello was also, in these years, a husband and a father, and in 1921 he suffered the kind of loss that breaks something permanent in a person. His young daughter died. The record is thin on the details, the way records so often are for immigrant families in that era, their private grief swallowed up by history's indifference. But it's believed that this loss was part of what finally pushed Joe to leave Utica behind entirely. Whatever ties had kept him anchored to that gritty river town, whatever fragile domestic peace he'd built with Caterina and their children, it wasn't enough to hold him there any longer. Something in him had broken, or hardened, or both. And so, sometime around 1920, Joe Aiello did what so many ambitious and dangerous men of his generation eventually did. He went to Chicago. If Utica was the incubator, Chicago was the arena. By the time Joe Aiello arrived in the Windy City, it was already the most notorious criminal battleground in the country, a city convulsing under the twin pressures of prohibition and immigration, its underworld splintering into ethnic factions that would spend the entire decade trying to kill each other into submission. The Irish North Side gang controlled territory along the river. The Sicilian brothers ruled Little Italy with a terrifying and often chaotic brutality, running a small army of home-based moonshine stills that turned entire blocks of tenement housing into illegal distilleries. And looming over all of it, growing more powerful and more ruthless by the month, was the South Side outfit that would eventually be led by a young, ambitious lieutenant named Al Capone. Joe didn't arrive in Chicago as a nobody. His father, Carlo, along with his brothers, had already begun establishing a foothold in the city, the family's fruit and grocery businesses expanding westward, following the same instincts that had carried them from Bagheria to Utica in the first place. And Joe brought with him something just as valuable as capital: he brought relationships. Ties to the Sicilian criminal networks back in Utica and Buffalo, connections that stretched from upstate New York all the way down into Chicago's Little Sicily, the tightly packed immigrant neighborhood on the near north side where the Old World Mafia, distinct in culture and loyalty from Capone's more Americanized, multi-ethnic outfit, still held sway. It was here, in the crowded streets of Little Sicily, that Joe Aiello began his true ascent. He partnered early with a man named Antonio Lombardo, a fellow Sicilian who ran a grocery and had his own ambitions within the Unione Siciliana, a fraternal organization that had started, decades earlier, as a legitimate benevolent society for Italian immigrants, insurance, community support, a place for new arrivals to find their footing in a strange country. But by the 1920s, the Unione Siciliana in Chicago had been hollowed out and repurposed, its structure and its dues-paying membership transformed into a criminal apparatus, its presidency a coveted and murderously contested prize that conferred enormous influence over the city's bootlegging trade. Joe and Lombardo worked together in those early Chicago years, building a partnership that seemed, for a time, to promise both men a comfortable rise through the ranks of the Sicilian underworld. But partnerships built on ambition rarely survive the moment when both partners want the same crown. And there was, waiting just beyond the horizon, an entire war being fought over exactly that crown: control of the Unione Siciliana, and with it, control of the liquor rackets that were making men rich beyond anything their fathers could have imagined back in the old country. The Genna brothers, 6 of them, had been the dominant Sicilian force in Chicago through the early 1920s, running their sprawling network of home distilleries with a mixture of violence and old-world patronage. But the Gennas made a fatal miscalculation: they went to war with the Irish North Side Gang, led first by Dean O'Banion and then, after his assassination in his own flower shop in 1924, by the increasingly unstable and vengeful Himmy Weiss. The North Siders fought back hard, and by 1925, the Genna brothers were being picked off one by one, gunned down in the street, their once formidable organization collapsing into chaos. It was into this vacuum that Joe Aiello stepped, and this is where the story truly begins to sharpen into the shape we recognize, the shape of a man clawing his way toward the top of one of the most violent criminal hierarchies in American history, at the exact moment when that hierarchy was tearing itself apart. Joe and his brothers moved to absorb what remained of the Genna operation, taking over territory, absorbing surviving Genna associates into their own growing organization, and by the mid-1920s, the Aiello family had positioned itself as the most significant Sicilian criminal power left standing in Chicago. Joe built a home in the Rogers Park Manor development on the city's north side, a strikingly bold move for a gangster, buying into one of the city's more affluent new residential communities and constructing, according to those who remembered it, the largest house in the entire development. A grand statement of arrival for a Sicilian farm boy who had once stood shivering on a dock in New York with nothing but the clothes on his back. But wealth and property were never going to be enough for Joe Aiello, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him if you want to understand everything that happens next in this story. He did not simply want to be rich. He wanted to be recognized. He wanted the presidency of the Unione Siciliana, the title, the legitimacy, the sense that the old world hierarchy he'd grown up respecting back in Bagheria now bent the knee to him. And standing between Joe Aiello and that ambition was his former partner, Antonio Lombardo, a man who, in the mid-1920s, made the decision that would ultimately doom him and plunge Chicago into some of the bloodiest years its underworld had ever seen. Lombardo allied himself with Al Capone. It's hard to overstate how enormous a betrayal this felt like to Joe Aiello. Capone, in the eyes of men like Aiello, was an outsider twice over, not just an American-born gangster building his own multi-ethnic criminal empire, but specifically not Sicilian, a distinction that mattered enormously within the rigid, blood and honor-bound culture of the old Unione Siciliana. For Lombardo to hand Capone influence over the organization, for Lombardo to essentially install a non-Sicilian power broker at the heart of an institution meant to serve and protect Sicilian immigrants, was, in Joe's eyes, a betrayal not just of their partnership but of something deeper, of blood, of heritage, of the entire world Joe Aiello had carried with him across an ocean 20 years earlier. And so, sometime around 1926, the partnership shattered completely. Joe Aiello, denied the position he believed was rightfully his, severed every remaining tie with Lombardo and turned, in a move that would define the rest of his life, toward an alliance with the very men his Sicilian predecessors had spent years fighting, the Irish North Side Gang, first under Himy Weiss, and later, after Weiss himself was gunned down in 1926 in a hail of machine gun fire outside Holy Name Cathedral, under Weiss's volatile and vengeful successor, a man named George Bugs Moran. It was an alliance built entirely on a shared enemy. The North Siders wanted Capone dead for killing their own. Joe Aiello wanted Capone destroyed for stealing his throne. And together, these two damaged, embittered factions, one Irish, one Sicilian, with a history of mutual bloodshed between them, set their sights on bringing down the most powerful gangster Chicago had ever produced. What followed was a campaign of violence so relentless, so audacious, that it would eventually earn Joe Aiello a place on the Chicago Crime Commission's public enemies list, ranked 7th among the most dangerous criminals in the city. Joe would try, repeatedly, almost obsessively, to have Al Capone killed. He put a bounty on Capone's head. He attempted, according to Underworld legend, to bribe a restaurant chef into poisoning Capone's soup with prussic acid, offering a staggering sum of money for the job. He brought in out-of-town gunmen, hired assassins from New York, anyone willing to take a shot at ending Capone's life. Every single attempt failed. And every failure only deepened the hatred between the two men, tightening a noose that both of them were, in their own ways, walking toward. By the end of the 1920s, Joe Aiello would find himself standing, however briefly, at the very peak of the Sicilian underworld in Chicago, the presidency of the Unione Siciliana finally within his grasp, achieved through blood, through betrayal, through the deaths of men who had once called him a friend. But every king in this world wears a target instead of a crown, and Joe Aiello was about to learn just how heavy that target could be. Because Al Capone did not forget. Al Capone did not forgive. And Al Capone was not a man who allowed his enemies to sleep peacefully, no matter how many locks they put on their doors, no matter how many bodyguards they surrounded themselves with, no matter how far they ran. The war between Joe Aiello and Al Capone was only just beginning. And in the chapters that follow, we will watch it consume everything, friendships, alliances, entire criminal empires, and eventually, a body left in the street, riddled with 59 bullets, a final, brutal punctuation mark on the life of the boss who simply would not back down. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a city right before it erupts into open war, a silence that isn't peace at all, but a held breath, a held knife, 1,000 men quietly checking the chambers of their guns and telling themselves it isn't going to be them who dies this time. Chicago in the late 1920s lived inside that silence for years at a stretch, punctuated by sudden, deafening violence that would leave a man dead on a sidewalk or bleeding out in a barbershop chair, and then the silence would descend again, thicker than before, while the whole city waited to see who would move next. Joe Aiello had made his choice. He had turned his back on Antonio Lombardo, his former partner, the man who had once stood beside him building grocery stores and cheese importing businesses on the near North Side, and now Lombardo sat in the presidency of the Unione Siciliana with Al Capone's muscle behind him, while Joe Aiello sat in his grand new house in Rogers Park Manor, staring out across Indian Boundary Park, nursing a hatred that had nowhere left to go but forward. And forward it went. Aiello did not simply resent Capone from a distance. He came at him directly, again and again, with a persistence that bordered on obsession. Word moved through the underworld, quietly, the way all the important information moved in that world, through barbershops and back rooms and the kind of conversations men had while pretending to talk about something else, that Joe Aiello had put a price on Al Capone's head. Some said it started at $50,000. Others said the number grew as attempt after attempt failed and Aiello's frustration curdled into something closer to desperation. He brought in outside guns. This was itself a kind of insult in the code of that underworld, reaching beyond your own family, beyond your own city, to import killers who had no history with the target, no hesitation, no complicated loyalties that might make them pull a punch at the last second. Aiello imported gunmen from New York, men with no ties to Chicago and no reason to fear the consequences of failure beyond the consequences themselves. He set them up in rooms and apartments with clear lines of sight onto Capone's known routes, onto restaurants Capone was known to frequent, onto the hotel where Capone kept a suite. Chicago police, tipped off, some say by Capone's own extensive network of informants and paid officers, raided at least one of these hideouts before a shot could be fired, arresting the gunman and sending yet another message that Al Capone was simply not a man who could be killed by conventional means, not in his own city, not on his own streets. There is a story, retold so many times in the folklore of the era that it has taken on the texture of legend, that Aiello once tried to reach Capone through his stomach rather than through a gun barrel. The tale goes that Joe attempted to bribe a chef, a man named Joseph Diamond Joe Esposito, according to some tellings, offering a small fortune to slip poison into a bowl of soup that would eventually be set down in front of Al Capone. Whether every detail of that story survived the retelling intact hardly matters. What matters is what the story reveals about how deeply Aiello's hatred had burrowed into the daily texture of Capone's life. Capone could not eat safely. He could not walk a familiar street without wondering if today was the day. He could not fall asleep without armed men standing outside every door of wherever he was staying. This was not merely a business rivalry over control of bootlegging profits. This had become something closer to a blood feud, ancient in its intensity even though it was being fought with automobiles and Thompson submachine guns instead of swords. And Capone, for his part, was not a man who absorbed this kind of aggression passively. Whatever restraint he showed, and by the standards of Chicago's underworld in that era, Capone often showed considerable strategic patience, preferring to let his enemies destroy themselves through their own chaos when he could. There were limits, and Joe Aiello had found them. Capone's own men began moving against Aiello's people, tit for tat, an escalating rhythm of violence that turned entire blocks of Little Sicily into contested ground where a man could be shot for simply standing on the wrong corner at the wrong hour. It was in this climate, this thick, hostile atmosphere of mutual assassination attempts and simmering paranoia, that the next great betrayal of the story unfolded. Antonio Lombardo, sitting in the Unione Siciliana presidency that Aiello believed should have been his, was gunned down on a crowded Chicago street in September of 1928, shot in broad daylight in front of witnesses who, in the time-honored tradition of that underworld, somehow all failed to see anything useful when the police came asking questions. Lombardo died from his wounds, and with his death, the seat of power at the heart of Chicago's Sicilian underworld once again sat empty, waiting for the next man ruthless enough to claim it. Nearly everyone in Chicago's underworld understood immediately who was responsible, even if no one could ever make it stick in a courtroom. Joe Aiello, allied now with Bugs Moran's North Side gang, was widely believed to have orchestrated Lombardo's killing, using Moran's own hitmen to carry out the execution, a grim, almost poetic irony, given that the North Siders and the Sicilian Old World Mafia had spent years killing each other before circumstance and shared hatred of Capone pushed them into an uneasy alliance. Lombardo's death was, in the coldest possible sense, a strategic masterstroke for Aiello. It removed his rival, humiliated Capone by striking down Capone's own hand-picked man, and cracked open the door to the presidency Aiello had wanted for years. But the door did not open easily, and it certainly did not open safely. Capone, enraged by Lombardo's murder and unwilling to simply let Aiello walk into the position his own ally had just been killed to protect, backed a new candidate for the Unione presidency, a man named Pasqualino Patsy Lolordo. For a few months, it must have seemed to Lolordo that he had inherited a position of tremendous prestige and influence. In reality, he had inherited a death sentence. In January of 1929, Lolordo was shot to death in his own home, in his own living room, reportedly by men he considered friends, men he had welcomed into his house and sat down with to share a drink before the guns came out. Once again, the underworld suspicion fell immediately and almost universally on Joe Aiello. Once again, no charges would ever hold. Two Unione presidents dead within a matter of months, both killed in ways that pointed, with grim consistency, back toward the same ambitious, relentless man on the north side. It is worth pausing here to consider what this reveals about Joe Aiello's character, because this is the heart of who he was, not simply a violent man, of which Prohibition-era Chicago had no shortage, but a man of extraordinary, almost frightening persistence. Other men, facing the kind of resistance Aiello had faced, failed assassination attempts, police raids on his hired killers, the near-total dominance Capone held over the machinery of the city, including its police force and its politicians, might have cut their losses, made peace, accepted a smaller share of the pie in exchange for staying alive. Joe Aiello did not do this. Every setback seemed only to sharpen his resolve. Every failed attempt on Capone's life seemed only to convince him that the next attempt would be the one that finally succeeded. There was, briefly, an attempt to broker peace between the warring factions, orchestrated by a man whose name would come to loom over the entire American Mafia in these years, Giuseppe Masseria of New York, known in the underworld simply as Joe the Boss, the reigning power broker among the East Coast's Italian criminal organizations. Masseria, sensing an opportunity to expand his own influence westward and perhaps genuinely hoping to prevent Chicago's underworld from tearing itself completely apart, attempted to mediate between Aiello and Capone in early 1929. It did not go well. Rather than calming the conflict, Masseria's intervention only managed to insult Aiello further, and by extension, it alienated Aiello's allies far beyond Chicago's city limits, criminal factions in Detroit, in Buffalo, in Brooklyn, all of whom had their own complicated loyalties and grievances within the larger web of the American Mafia. What should have been a peace conference instead planted the seeds of a far larger and bloodier conflict, one that would soon be known to history as the Castellammarese War, a struggle for control of the entire American Mafia structure that would eventually stretch from Chicago all the way to the streets of New York City. But before that larger war could fully ignite, there was still the immediate, brutal business of Chicago to attend to. And it was here, in February of 1929, that Al Capone delivered the single most devastating blow of the entire conflict, a message so violent, so theatrical in its brutality, that it would echo through American criminal history for the rest of the century. On the morning of February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day, men dressed as police officers entered a garage on North Clark Street where several members of Bugs Moran's North Side gang had gathered, supposedly to receive a shipment of stolen or bootleg liquor. Believing themselves to be facing a routine police shakedown, the men lined up against the wall as instructed, hands raised, cooperating with what they thought was simply another cost of doing business in a city where the police were as much a part of the racket as anyone else. Then the machine guns came out. 7 men were killed in a matter of seconds, their bodies left crumpled against the garage wall in a scene so shocking that newspapers across the entire country ran photographs of the aftermath. It became known, almost instantly, as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and it remains, to this day, one of the most infamous single acts of violence in the entire history of American organized crime. Bugs Moran himself, by sheer chance, was not present at the garage that morning. He arrived late and, seeing police cars outside, turned around and left, a decision that likely saved his life, though it did nothing to save the North Side gang's power. The massacre effectively broke Moran's organization, stripping away the muscle and manpower that Joe Aiello had relied on as his primary ally in the war against Capone. For Moran, the massacre was a catastrophic, organization-ending blow. For Aiello, it was something almost worse, a stark, undeniable demonstration of exactly what Al Capone was capable of, and exactly how far he was willing to go to eliminate the men standing against him. And yet, this is the detail that separates Joe Aiello from so many of his contemporaries, the detail that makes his story worth telling nearly a century later, even after the massacre, even after watching his closest allies' organization gunned down in a single coordinated act of horrifying violence. Joe Aiello did not fold. He did not flee Chicago permanently. He did not seek terms. Instead, in the months that followed, with Capone's organization momentarily distracted by the massive wave of public and law enforcement outrage the massacre had generated, outrage so intense that it would eventually contribute to Capone's downfall through tax evasion charges rather than murder charges. Since the murder charges could never be made to stick, Joe Aiello made his move. He finally claimed the presidency of the Unione Siciliana. It should have felt, after everything, after Lombardo, after Lolordo, after years of failed assassination attempts and imported gunmen and police raids, like a triumph. And in some narrow sense, it was. Joe Aiello, the farm boy from Bagheria, the foundry worker from Utica, the man who had lost a daughter and buried a partnership and turned an entire underworld faction against the most powerful gangster in America, had finally achieved the thing he wanted more than anything else: recognition, legitimacy, the title that told every Sicilian gangster in Chicago that he, and not Al Capone's puppet, sat at the head of their table. But there is a particular kind of tragedy embedded in stories like this one, a tragedy that anyone who has studied the rise and fall of powerful men will recognize immediately. The throne Joe Aiello had spent years fighting to claim was, by the time he finally sat down in it, already soaked in the blood of the men who had occupied it before him. It was not a seat of safety. It was not a seat of peace. It was, in the coldest and most literal sense, a marked position, a chair that Al Capone had already demonstrated, twice over, he was willing to have emptied by force whenever its occupant became inconvenient. Joe Aiello knew this. He was not a naive man. He understood, better than almost anyone alive in Chicago at that moment, exactly what kind of target he had just placed on his own back. And in the months that followed his ascension to the Unione presidency, we will watch him do everything in his power to protect himself, fortifying his properties, surrounding himself with armed guards, fleeing the city more than once when the danger grew too immediate to ignore, reaching out to allies as far away as New York in a desperate bid to build a coalition strong enough to finally, permanently break Capone's grip on Chicago. It would not be enough. But the fight that Joe Aiello waged in these final months of his life, a fight against the most powerful and most ruthless criminal organization the country had ever seen, waged by a man who refused, again and again, to simply accept defeat, is a fight that deserves to be understood in full. Because what comes next in this story is not simply the story of one gangster's death. It is the story of the entire American Mafia tearing itself apart in a war for control of its own future, and Joe Aiello, whether he intended it or not, would become one of the central, defining casualties of that war. The wolves of Chicago were closing in. And Joe Aiello, cornered, wounded, but still unbroken, was about to make his final stand. There is an old truth about power in the underworld that every gangster eventually learns, usually too late to do anything about it. The moment you finally get what you spent years fighting for, you discover that the fight was never actually about the prize. It was about survival. And once you're sitting on the throne, survival becomes 1,000 times harder, because now everyone can see exactly where to find you. Joe Aiello learned this lesson in the cruelest way imaginable. By 1929, he had achieved what he had wanted since the moment he first arrived in Chicago nearly a decade earlier, the presidency of the Unione Siciliana, the seat of legitimacy and influence within the old-world Sicilian underworld that he had watched two other men die for. He had the title. He had, on paper, the recognition. And within months of claiming it, he understood, with the particular clarity that comes to men who have spent their whole lives reading danger in a room before anyone else notices it, that he was now living on borrowed time. Al Capone had not forgotten the years of assassination attempts. He had not forgotten the poison plot, the imported gunmen, the drive-by shooting that had shredded the windows of the Aiello family bakery in Little Sicily back in 1927. He had not forgotten that Aiello was almost certainly behind the deaths of both Antonio Lombardo and Patsy Lolordo, the two men Capone himself had tried to install in the very position Aiello now occupied. And Capone was not a man who let old debt sit unpaid for long. The only reason Aiello was still breathing at all by the time he took his seat as Unione president was that Capone, in the aftermath of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, found himself the target of an unprecedented wave of national outrage, newspapers screaming for justice, federal investigators circling, the kind of public pressure that made even a man as untouchable as Capone think twice about ordering another headline-grabbing murder in the middle of Chicago streets. But pressure like that never lasts forever, and Joe Aiello knew it. So he did what any man in his position would do if he had even a shred of survival instinct left in him. He ran. It would not be the first time. Long before he ever claimed the Unione presidency, Aiello had already been forced to flee Chicago on more than one occasion during the years of open warfare with Capone's organization, retreating to the safety of allied cities where his enemy's reach was weaker and his own connections ran deeper. Buffalo, in particular, became something of a refuge for him, a city with its own established Sicilian Mafia network, one that shared Aiello's old-world loyalties and had no particular love for Al Capone or his increasingly Americanized, multi-ethnic style of organized crime. It was in Buffalo, and in the surrounding network of Castellammarese-aligned mafiosi scattered across the country, that Joe Aiello would spend much of what remained of his life, moving in and out of hiding, always watching the door, always keeping an escape route open. Because here is the deeper story unfolding underneath Joe Aiello's personal war with Al Capone, a story far larger than one city, one bootlegging rivalry, or one grudge over a stolen presidency. By the late 1920s, the entire structure of the American Mafia was fracturing along ancient fault lines that stretched back to Sicily itself. On one side stood the forces of Giuseppe Masuria, the New York boss known throughout the underworld simply as Joe the Boss, a man of considerable ambition who had spent years attempting to position himself as the supreme authority over Italian organized crime in America, demanding tribute and loyalty from crime families in cities far beyond his native New York. On the other side stood a rising rival named Salvatore Maranzano, himself a native of the Sicilian town of Castellamare del Golfo, who had built a powerful coalition of fellow Castellammarese and Old World traditionalists determined to resist Masuria's growing dominance. Joe Aiello, through the deep Old World ties that ran through his years in Utica and Buffalo, had long been connected to this same network of Castellammarese loyalists, men like Stefano Megadino in Buffalo, sometimes called the Undertaker, for the funeral home business he used as one of his fronts, and Gaspar Milazzo in Detroit, both of whom had roots in that same tight-knit Sicilian community that traced its bonds back to villages and blood relations on the other side of the Atlantic. When the simmering tensions between Masuria and Maranzano finally erupted into open war in February of 1930, a conflict that would come to be known as the Castellammarese War, Joe Aiello did not hesitate about which side he belonged to. He threw his support, and the resources of his Chicago organization, firmly behind Maranzano and the Castellammarese cause. This alliance mattered enormously, and not simply as a matter of Old World sentiment or blood loyalty. It mattered because Al Capone, despite operating out of Chicago rather than New York, had aligned himself as an ally of Masuria, a relationship that had been cemented, ironically, around the very same period that Aiello's feud with Capone was reaching its most violent peak. Masuria had granted Capone a form of mafia recognition years earlier, naming him a capodecina, a kind of honorary lieutenant, within his own organization, a gesture of respect from New York's reigning boss of bosses that had infuriated Aiello and his Castellammarese allies precisely because it legitimized a man they considered an outsider, a non-Sicilian upstart who had no business wielding influence within the Old World hierarchy. So by 1930, the lines of the conflict had become almost perfectly symmetrical, a mirror image stretched across the entire eastern half of the country. In New York, Masuria's forces fought Maranzano's Castellammarese coalition. In Chicago, Capone, Masuria's ally, continued his long war against Aiello, who now stood as one of Maranzano's most prominent and valuable allies outside of New York itself. Two wars, fought on two fronts, but bound together by the same underlying struggle for control of an entire criminal underworld that was, in these years, still deciding what shape it would ultimately take. For Joe Aiello, this alliance offered something he had been searching for since the moment Antonio Lombardo first betrayed their partnership back in the mid-1920s, a network of powerful friends who understood exactly what he was fighting for, and who had their own compelling reasons to want Al Capone weakened, humiliated, or destroyed entirely. It offered him legitimacy on a national scale, connections stretching from Chicago to Buffalo to Detroit to the heart of the Castellammarese stronghold in Brooklyn. And for a brief window of time, in the early months of 1930, it must have felt to Joe Aiello like the tide was finally, after years of struggle, beginning to turn in his favor. But alliances built in the middle of a war are rarely stable, and the deeper Joe Aiello waded into the machinery of the Castellammarese War, the more he became entangled in a conflict whose true stakes reached far beyond his own personal grievance against Al Capone. There was a conference held in Cleveland in 1928, a gathering of mafia figures from across the country, ostensibly convened to discuss questions of leadership and territory within the Unione Siciliana structure, but really functioning as a summit of the various factions jockeying for position in the years leading up to the larger war. Joe Aiello attended, or sent representatives, seeking support for his claim to the Unione presidency from sympathetic bosses in other cities. He found some of that support among allies like the Nicolosi brothers, a Sicilian family with their own standing in Chicago's underworld. But even these alliances came with a cost. One of Aiello's representatives at the Cleveland gathering, a man named Sam Oliveri, lost a brother to Capone's forces not long afterward, and Oliveri himself would later come under suspicion of quietly brokering some kind of accommodation with Capone's people, a reminder, if Joe Aiello needed one, that in this world even your closest allies were constantly calculating whether loyalty to you was still worth the risk to their own lives. This is, perhaps, the most exhausting and corrosive part of Joe Aiello's final years, not simply the physical danger of assassination, though that danger was constant and very real, but the psychological toll of never being able to fully trust anyone around him. Every ally was a potential informant. Every safe house was a potential trap. Every meeting arranged by a friend carried the possibility that the friend had already been paid, or threatened, or simply frightened into cooperating with the men who wanted Joe Aiello dead. This is what it means to live as a hunted man in that world, not a single dramatic chase scene, but a slow, grinding erosion of every certainty you once had, until you find yourself checking the same door twice, changing your route home for no reason you can quite articulate, waking in the middle of the night at a sound that turns out to be nothing at all. And through all of it, remarkably, Joe Aiello kept fighting. He did not retreat into permanent hiding and simply wait out the war from the safety of Buffalo or Detroit. He continued directing operations back in Chicago, continued asserting his authority as Unione president even while spending much of his time outside the city, continued working the Castellammarese network for support, resources, and information about Capone's movements. There is something almost stubborn, almost defiant, in the way Aiello refused to simply disappear. Other men in his position, and there were plenty of examples throughout the era of gangsters who fled a losing war and lived out their remaining years quietly, in obscurity, far from the cities where they had once held power, chose survival through invisibility. Joe Aiello chose survival through continued resistance, a decision that speaks to exactly the quality that gives this story its title. He would not back down. Even facing the most powerful and most ruthless criminal organization in the country, even having already survived the near-total collapse of his primary allies' organization at the St. Valentine's Day massacre, even watching his own predecessors in the Unione presidency die one after another in acts of shocking violence, Joe Aiello kept his hand on the wheel of his own war. By the autumn of 1930, however, the pressures bearing down on him had reached a breaking point that even his considerable resilience could not withstand indefinitely. The Castellammarese War in New York was grinding forward with escalating brutality, Masuria's forces and Maranzano's forces trading assassinations in a rhythm that seemed to accelerate with each passing month, key lieutenants on both sides falling to ambushes and betrayals that blurred, more and more, the original lines the conflict had been drawn along. And in Chicago, Al Capone's organization, having weathered the worst of the public outrage over the St. Valentine's Day massacre, was beginning to turn its full attention back to the unfinished business of Joe Aiello. Word reached Aiello, according to accounts pieced together in the years after his death, that the danger closing in on him had become more immediate and more specific than the general, ambient threat he had lived under for years. There were reports of Capone's men actively searching for his whereabouts, tracking down safe houses, questioning associates about his movements. Joe Aiello, ever cautious, ever aware of exactly how thin the margin between survival and death had become for a man in his position, retreated to a place he believed offered him safety, an apartment on Chicago's west side, away from his known properties, away from the grand house in Rogers Park Manor that had once symbolized everything he had built since stepping off that boat from Sicily as a 17-year-old boy with nothing to his name. It should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it would become the final trap. Because here is the terrible, almost unbearable irony sitting at the heart of Joe Aiello's story, the irony that anyone who has studied the long, blood-soaked history of organized crime in America will recognize instantly. The very qualities that had carried him from a foundry in Utica to the presidency of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Chicago, his relentlessness, his refusal to simply accept a smaller share of power, his willingness to keep fighting long after any rational man would have folded, were the same qualities that made it impossible for him to ever truly disappear. A man who simply wanted to survive might have vanished into some quiet corner of the country under a different name, living out his days far from the war he had helped ignite. But Joe Aiello was not that kind of man. He kept fighting, kept directing, kept reaching for allies and information and advantage, right up until the moment his enemies finally, patiently, found the thread that led them to his door. In the chapter that follows, we will walk with Joe Aiello through the final days of his life, the tightening circle of danger, the last desperate maneuvers of a man who had spent his entire adult life refusing to yield, and the brutal, almost incomprehensible violence that would finally bring the war between Joe Aiello and Al Capone to its terrible, definitive conclusion. Because what happened next on that quiet Chicago street would not simply end one man's life. It would send shockwaves through an underworld already tearing itself apart, and it would leave behind a question that historians and mafia chroniclers would still be debating, nearly a century later, the question of who, exactly, gave the order that finally silenced the boss who wouldn't back down. Every gangster story worth telling eventually arrives at a particular kind of morning, a morning that looks, on its surface, like every other morning that came before it. The sun rises the same way. The streets fill with the same ordinary sounds of a city going about its business, streetcars rattling past, vendors setting up their carts, children walking to school with no idea that history is about to be written a few blocks from where they're standing. And somewhere inside that ordinary morning, a man who has spent years running, fighting, scheming, and surviving finally takes a step he cannot take back. By October of 1930, Joe Aiello had been living on borrowed time for so long that the borrowing itself had almost become a kind of normal life. He had survived the collapse of his partnership with Antonio Lombardo. He had survived the deaths of two Unione Siciliana presidents who came before him, both killed under circumstances that pointed directly back at his own hand. He had survived failed assassination attempts against Al Capone that should have, by any reasonable measure, gotten him killed the moment they failed. He had survived the devastating fallout of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, an event that could easily have swept him up in its violence had circumstances broken only slightly differently. He had survived years of hiding in Buffalo, Detroit, and wherever else his Castellammarese allies could offer him shelter, always calculating, always moving, always one step ahead of the men who wanted him dead. But survival of that kind exacts a price, and the price is exhaustion, not merely physical exhaustion, though the strain of constant vigilance surely wore on a man even as resilient as Joe Aiello, but a deeper, more corrosive exhaustion of the spirit. There is only so long a person can live at that pitch of alertness, checking every window, questioning every friend, calculating every risk before it becomes almost unbearable simply to exist. And it was into this state of grinding, accumulated exhaustion that Joe Aiello made the decision, in the autumn of 1930, to take shelter in an apartment on Chicago's West Side, a building he believed offered him a measure of anonymity that his more prominent properties no longer could. He was not entirely wrong to seek it out. For a time, the apartment did exactly what he needed it to do, it kept him hidden, kept him breathing, kept him one address ahead of the men hunting him. But hiding is only ever a temporary solution in a war like the one Joe Aiello had spent years fighting, because a hiding place is only as secure as the loyalty of everyone who knows about it, and by 1930, after everything that had happened, after every betrayal that had already reshaped the landscape of Chicago's underworld, Joe Aiello had very few people left whose loyalty he could take entirely for granted. On the morning of October 23, 1930, Joe Aiello prepared to leave that apartment. Whatever business called him out into the street that day, and accounts differ on the precise details of where he believed he was going or what he intended to do, the simple act of stepping outside was, for a man in his position, an act of enormous risk. Every departure from a safe house was a calculated gamble, a moment when a hunted man briefly surrendered the protection of walls and locked doors and exposed himself to whatever might be waiting in the open air. Waiting for him that morning, positioned across the street or in a nearby building with the patient, professional stillness of men who had rehearsed exactly this moment, were gunmen armed with Thompson submachine guns, the same weapon that had become, by 1930, almost a signature of Chicago's gangland violence, the weapon that had turned the St. Valentine's Day garage into a slaughterhouse the year before. As Joe Aiello stepped out of the building at the corner of Colmar and West End Avenues, the gunman opened fire. What followed was not simply an assassination. It was an obliteration. The gunmen fired again and again, sustaining their attack with a level of intensity that went far beyond anything necessary simply to kill a man. When it was finally over, when the guns fell silent and the shooters melted back into the city that had raised so many of them, Joe Aiello's body lay in the street bearing the marks of 59 separate bullet wounds. 59. It is a number that stops you when you first encounter it, a number that refuses to be read simply as a fact of history and instead forces you to sit with its meaning. This was not an execution carried out with the minimum violence required to end a life. This was a message, written in gunfire, meant to be read by every man in Chicago's underworld who might have been considering standing against Al Capone the way Joe Aiello had stood against him for the better part of a decade. News of Aiello's death spread through Chicago and across the country within hours. Newspapers, which had spent years chronicling the violent back and forth between Aiello and Capone, ran the story with the particular blend of horror and fascination that had come to define Prohibition-era crime reporting, front-page headlines proclaiming that Capone's greatest enemy had finally been shot down, detailed accounts of the ambush, speculation about what it meant for the ongoing gang war that had turned Chicago into a national symbol of lawlessness and violence. One newspaper's headline distilled the story to its starkest essence: Capone's enemy, shot to death. And for years afterward, that was simply how the story was understood and retold, a straightforward, if brutal, conclusion to the long and bloody feud between Al Capone and Joe Aiello. Capone had finally caught up with the man who had spent years trying to have him killed, who had put a price on his head, who had allegedly tried to poison his food, who had orchestrated or was widely believed to have orchestrated the deaths of two Unione Siciliana presidents that Capone himself had backed. It was, in the popular telling, simple and brutal justice, the final chapter in a war that had consumed Chicago's underworld for years. But history, especially the history of organized crime, rarely stays as simple as its first telling suggests. And this is where Joe Aiello's story takes on a layer of intrigue that would not fully surface until years later, when some of the men who had lived through this era began, quietly and selectively, to share what they claimed to actually know about what had happened behind the scenes. Because Joe Aiello's death did not occur in isolation. It occurred in the middle of the Castellammarese War, the larger conflict raging in New York between the forces of Giuseppe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, a conflict in which, as we've already seen, Joe Aiello had firmly aligned himself with Maranzano's Castellammarese coalition. And according to accounts that surfaced later, drawn from statements attributed to Charles "Lucky" Luciano, one of the most influential figures to emerge from that entire war and one of the architects of the modern American Mafia structure that would follow it, the order to kill Joe Aiello did not actually come from Al Capone at all. According to this version of events, it was Giuseppe Masuria, Joe the Boss himself, the New York power broker whose earlier attempt to mediate the feud between Aiello and Capone had only deepened the animosity between them, who gave the order for Aiello's assassination, carried out not by Capone's own men but by an ally of Masuria's named Alfred Mineo. In this telling, Joe Aiello's death becomes not simply the final settling of a personal Chicago vendetta, but a calculated strike in the much larger war being waged for control of the entire American Mafia, the elimination of one of Maranzano's most valuable and well-connected allies outside of New York, carried out by Masuria's own forces in an effort to weaken the Castellammarese coalition at a moment when the larger war hung in a delicate and uncertain balance. Whether this account represents the full and complete truth of what happened, or whether it is itself a piece of underworld mythology shaped and reshaped by decades of retelling, is a question that historians of organized crime continue to weigh even now, nearly a century later. What we can say with certainty is this: the ambiguity itself tells us something important about the world Joe Aiello lived and died in. This was a world where the line between personal vendetta and organizational strategy was never entirely clean, where a man's enemies could multiply and overlap until it became almost impossible to say, with confidence, exactly whose hand had truly pulled the trigger. Joe Aiello had made himself an enemy of Al Capone through years of open, personal warfare. He had also made himself, through his alliance with Maranzano, a strategic target within a much larger conflict that had nothing to do with Chicago at all. In the end, it may not have mattered which enemy finally acted first. Both had ample reason to want him dead, and in the world Joe Aiello inhabited, having two powerful men who wanted you dead at the same time was, in the end, no different from having one. What we do know, beyond any dispute, is what happened in the immediate aftermath of Joe Aiello's death, and how quickly the larger war that had claimed him began to shift. Within weeks of Aiello's assassination, the momentum of the Castellammarese War began turning decisively in Maranzano's favor. In early November of 1930, Manfredi Mineo, despite his brother Alfred's alleged role in carrying out Aiello's killing, if that account is accurate, was himself gunned down alongside another key Masuria lieutenant, Steve Ferrigno, struck down on the same day in a reprisal that mirrored the ruthless efficiency of Aiello's own murder weeks earlier. It was as though Joe Aiello's death, rather than simply eliminating a troublesome enemy, had instead accelerated a chain reaction of violence that would ultimately consume the very men who may have ordered his killing in the first place. The war ground on for months after that, through a rising tide of assassinations and shifting loyalties that eventually blurred the original battle lines beyond recognition, as lower-ranking members of Masuria's own organization, sensing which way the tide was turning, began defecting to Maranzano's side. It would not conclude until the following spring, in April of 1931, when Masuria himself was gunned down while eating dinner at a Coney Island restaurant, betrayed, according to the most widely accepted account, by his own supposed ally Lucky Luciano, who had quietly struck a deal with Maranzano to end the war by removing Masuria from the equation entirely. Maranzano would go on to declare himself the supreme boss of the American Mafia, the Capo di Tutti I Capi, and would oversee the reorganization of New York's criminal families into the five-family structure that continues to define the American Mafia's public understanding to this day. Joe Aiello did not live to see any of it. He did not live to see the war he had helped fight resolve itself into the modern mafia structure that his allies would ultimately help create. He did not live to see Al Capone's own downfall just months later, brought low not by any bullet but by federal tax evasion charges that would send Chicago's most notorious gangster to prison in 1931, effectively ending the era of open, spectacular gang warfare that had defined the city throughout the 1920s. Joe Aiello's story ends not with vindication, not with triumph, not even with the grim satisfaction of watching his greatest enemy fall in turn. It ends in the street, in the gray light of an October morning, his body left where it fell, a final and brutal punctuation mark on a life defined, from its very first chapter in Bagheria to its last on the corner of Colmar and West End, by a refusal to ever simply accept defeat. Riverside Cemetery in Rochester, New York, far from the Chicago streets where he built and lost his empire, would become his final resting place, a quiet ending, in a quiet city, for a man whose life had been anything but quiet. But a story like this one does not end simply with a body in the street. It ends with a legacy, with the question of what, exactly, a man like Joe Aiello actually accomplished across all those years of blood and ambition, and with the deeper, more uncomfortable question of whether his refusal to back down should be remembered as courage, as stubbornness, or as something more complicated and human than either of those simple labels can capture. In the chapters that remain, we will step back from the gunfire and the ambushes to consider the fuller shape of Joe Aiello's life, the family he left behind, the empire that outlived him only briefly, and the strange, uneasy place he occupies in the history of American organized crime, remembered by some as a footnote to Al Capone's more famous story, and by others as one of the last great holdouts of the old world Sicilian Mafia, a man who fought a war he could never fully win, against an enemy he could never fully defeat, right up until the very last bullet found him. There is a peculiar stillness that follows a killing like the one that ended Joe Aiello's life, not peace, never peace, but a kind of exhausted quiet that settles over a city the way dust settles after an explosion. Chicago in the days after October 23, 1930, was a city holding its breath, waiting to see what would rise up out of the wreckage of a war that had, by that point, consumed the better part of a decade and left a trail of bodies stretching from Little Sicily to the north side to the west side street corner where Joe Aiello finally fell. But wars like this one do not simply end because their central antagonist has been erased from the board. They ripple outward, they reshape the lives of everyone connected to the man who died, and they leave behind questions that take years, sometimes decades, to even begin answering. The first and most immediate question, in the hours and days after Aiello's death, was simple and brutal: who would fill the vacuum he left behind? The presidency of the Unione Siciliana, that cursed and coveted position that had already claimed the lives of Antonio Lombardo and Pasquale Lolordo before Joe Aiello himself was gunned down while occupying it, once again sat empty, a chair that history had already demonstrated was more likely to get a man killed than to make him powerful. And yet, even knowing this, even having watched 3 consecutive men die in connection with that very seat, there were still ambitious figures within Chicago's Sicilian underworld willing to reach for it, because that is simply how power works in a world built on violence. The danger of the throne rarely stops the men who believe they alone can survive sitting in it. But something had shifted by the final months of 1930, something larger than the simple question of who would next lead the Unione Siciliana in Chicago. The Castellammarese War raging in New York had begun to turn decisively, and Joe Aiello's death, whether ordered by Capone in a final settling of their personal blood feud or by Bagheria as a strategic strike against Maranzano's Castellammarese coalition, did not achieve what either man might have hoped. Rather than crushing the momentum of Maranzano's forces, Aiello's killing seemed only to accelerate a chain of retaliation that would, within months, bring down Bagheria himself. Manfredi Mineo, the very man some accounts credit with having orchestrated the Aiello hit on Bagheria's behalf, was gunned down alongside a fellow lieutenant named Steve Ferrigno barely 2 weeks later, cut down in the same brutal, efficient style that had ended Aiello's own life. It was as if the war had developed its own terrible momentum, a machine that consumed the men who fed it, regardless of which side of the conflict they claimed to serve. For the Aiello family itself, the loss of Joe was not merely the loss of a criminal boss but the loss of a patriarch, a husband, a father of 5 children who had grown up watching their father build an empire out of nothing and then, ultimately, watching that same empire cost him his life. Joe's wife, Caterina, was left to manage the aftermath of a marriage that had spanned continents and decades, from the quiet streets of Bagheria to the tenements of Utica to the grand, ill-fated house in Rogers Park Manor that had once stood as the most visible proof of everything Joe Aiello had achieved. Caterina, according to surviving records, was the one who identified her husband's body, the one who had to walk into whatever cold municipal room held his remains and confirm, in the most final and unbearable way possible, that the man she had married as a young woman in Utica so many years earlier was now simply gone. Joe's children, born across more than a decade of his rise through the underworld, inherited a complicated legacy. His daughter Lena, born around the time the family was still finding its footing in Utica. His son Carlo, born in 1919, carrying his grandfather's name into a new generation. Anthony, born in 1922, and Catherine, born in 1924, both arriving during the years when their father was consolidating power in Little Sicily, absorbing the remnants of the Genoa organization, building the alliance with Bugs Moran that would define the next phase of his life. And the younger Joseph, born in 1928, barely 2 years old when his father was killed, a child who would grow up with almost no direct memory of the man whose name he carried, only the stories, the rumors, and the enormous shadow that a father like Joe Aiello inevitably casts over the family he leaves behind. There is something worth sitting with here, something that the more sensational retellings of gangster history tend to skip past in their hurry to get to the next act of violence. Joe Aiello was, by every account, a man capable of extraordinary brutality, a man suspected of orchestrating the deaths of former friends and business partners, a man who imported hired killers from other cities, a man whose name became synonymous with one of the bloodiest personal vendettas in the entire history of Prohibition-era organized crime. And he was also, simultaneously, a husband who had built a life with the same woman for the better part of 2 decades, a father who had buried 1 child in Utica years before his own death claimed him, a man whose entire criminal ascent was tangled up, in ways that are impossible to fully untangle at this historical distance, with the ordinary human desire to provide for a family, to be recognized, to matter in a world that had given him very little starting material to work with. This is not an excuse for the violence he inflicted or ordered. It is simply the truth of how these stories actually work. The men who become legends of the underworld are never simply monsters in isolation. They are fathers and husbands and sons who made catastrophic, often unforgivable choices, and whose families were left to carry the weight of those choices long after the men themselves were gone. Joe Aiello's brothers, Sam, Peter, Nunzio, and Andrea, depending on which account and which period of the family's history you're examining, had been deeply embedded in his criminal enterprise for years, participating in the takeover of Genoa territory in the early 1920s, running the family's various bootlegging and grocery operations, sharing in both the profits and the extraordinary risks of life inside Chicago's Sicilian underworld. With Joe gone, the organization he had built did not simply collapse overnight, but it lost the singular, driving force that had held it together through years of war with Capone. The Aiello brothers who survived continued on in various capacities, some maintaining ties to organized crime in Chicago for years afterward, but none of them would ever again occupy the position of prominence that Joe himself had clawed his way into. The name Aiello, once spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect throughout Chicago's underworld, gradually faded from the headlines, overtaken by newer names, newer conflicts, newer men hungry for the same kind of power that had ultimately gotten Joe killed. And what of Al Capone, the man whose name will forever be linked to Joe Aiello's, the antagonist against whom Aiello had measured his entire adult life? For a brief window after Aiello's death, it might have seemed to outside observers that Capone had finally, definitively won. His most persistent and dangerous rival was dead. The Unione Siciliana presidency, the very institution Capone had spent years trying to control through proxies like Lombardo and Lolordo, was once again vulnerable to influence from his own organization. And when the Castellammarese War finally concluded the following spring, with Maranzano's victory and the reorganization of the Mafia into a new structure built around what would come to be called the Commission, Al Capone found himself designated as the representative for Chicago within that new national framework, recognition, in the most formal sense the underworld could offer, that he was now the unquestioned master of the city he had fought so long and so viciously to control. But history has a way of delivering its harshest irony precisely at the moment a man believes he has finally won everything he set out to win. Capone's triumph over Joe Aiello and the rest of his rivals proved to be almost unbearably brief. The very massacre that had cemented his reputation as Chicago's most fearsome gangster, the St. Valentine's Day killing that had crippled Bugs Moran's organization and, indirectly, weakened the alliance that had sustained Joe Aiello's war against him, had also drawn a level of national outrage and federal scrutiny that Capone would never fully escape. Investigators, unable to make murder charges against Capone stick in a city where witnesses had a well-documented habit of losing their memories the moment police started asking questions, turned instead to the one area of Capone's life he had been careless enough to leave exposed: his finances. In 1931, the same year that saw the bloody conclusion of the Castellammarese War play out in New York, Alabama, Capone was convicted of federal income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The man who had survived years of open gang warfare, who had ordered massacres and outmaneuvered enemies at every turn, who had buried the most persistent rival of his career in a hail of 59 bullets, was ultimately undone not by a gun but by a ledger, brought down by the same government that had spent a decade unable to touch him through any other means. There is a bitter symmetry buried in this sequence of events that deserves to be named plainly, because it is exactly the kind of detail that gives a story like this its weight. Joe Aiello spent the final years of his life trying, again and again, through poison and hired guns and imported killers, to end Al Capone's life directly, believing that only Capone's death could finally settle their war in his favor. He never came close to succeeding. And yet, within roughly a year of Aiello's own death, Al Capone's reign over Chicago effectively ended anyway, not through violence, not through the kind of dramatic gunfight that had defined their entire feud, but through the quiet, unglamorous machinery of federal tax law. Capone would spend most of the rest of his life either in prison or in declining health, his mind and body eventually ravaged by the effects of untreated syphilis, dying in 1947 a shadow of the man who had once ruled Chicago's underworld with such absolute, terrifying authority. Joe Aiello did not live to see any of this. He did not live to see his greatest enemy humbled, imprisoned, reduced. In a sense, both men lost. Aiello lost his life in the street, and Capone lost, eventually, everything he had killed to protect. Frank Nitti stepped into the practical leadership of Capone's organization following his imprisonment, continuing the operations of what had by then solidified into the entity history would remember as the Chicago Outfit, an organization that would persist for decades, long after every one of the men who had fought so viciously to shape it in the late 1920s had died or faded into irrelevance. The Unione Siciliana itself, the institution at the very heart of the entire war between Aiello and Capone, gradually lost much of its earlier significance as Prohibition itself approached its end in the early 1930s, the repeal of the Volstead Act in 1933 removing the single greatest source of illegal profit that had fueled the entire violent decade. Organized crime in Chicago did not disappear with the end of Prohibition, of course, it simply evolved, moved into new rackets, adapted to new economic realities, the way criminal organizations always do. But the specific, brutal chapter of Chicago's history defined by the war between Capone's outfit and the old world Sicilian Mafia that Joe Aiello had led was, by the middle of the 1930s, effectively closed. What remains, nearly a century later, is the story itself, fragmentary, contested in its details, pieced together from newspaper archives, genealogical records, court documents, and the occasional, unreliable recollection of men who had every reason to lie about what they actually knew. Joe Aiello occupies a strange and somewhat overlooked place in the popular memory of American organized crime. He is rarely the central figure of the stories told about this era. That role has almost always belonged to Al Capone, whose name became a kind of shorthand for the entire Prohibition gangster mythology, immortalized in films and books and popular culture in a way that Joe Aiello, despite the extraordinary scope and violence of his own criminal career, simply never was. Aiello exists, in most tellings, as a supporting character in someone else's legend, the persistent rival, the man who tried and failed to kill Capone, the footnote whose death gets mentioned mostly to illustrate just how dangerous and untouchable Capone himself had become. But that framing, however common, does an injustice to the actual shape of Joe Aiello's life. Because when you step back and look at the full arc of it, the 17-year-old boy stepping off a boat from Bagheria with nothing, the foundry work in Utica, the grief of losing a young daughter, the calculated and ruthless climb through Chicago's Sicilian underworld, the years of open warfare against the single most powerful gangster in American history, the alliances built and broken across state lines and mafia factions, the presidency finally claimed after two other men had already died. Reaching for it, and the brutal, almost theatrical violence of his final moments on a West Side street corner, what emerges is not a footnote. It is one of the most complete and dramatic arcs in the entire history of American organized crime, a genuine rise and fall story that happens to have unfolded in the shadow of a more famous name. In the chapters that remain, we will turn our attention more fully to that question, what Joe Aiello's story actually means, what it tells us about the particular brutality and structure of the Prohibition-era underworld, and why a man who fought so hard, for so long, against impossible odds still deserves to be remembered as more than simply the man Al Capone finally managed to kill. Because in the end, Joe Aiello's defining quality was never really about winning. It was about refusing to stop fighting, even when every rational calculation suggested that stopping was the only path to survival. That refusal cost him his life. It also, in its own strange and complicated way, secured him a permanent place in the bloody history of a city that has never stopped telling stories about the men who tried to rule it. To truly understand what Joe Aiello represented, and why his death carries a weight that goes beyond the simple math of one gangster killing another, you have to step back from the gunfire for a moment and look at the larger current he was swimming against, a current that was quietly, inexorably reshaping the entire structure of organized crime in America, whether the men caught up in it fully understood it or not. There is a term that historians of the Mafia would later use to describe men like Joe Aiello, a term that emerged from the very war that ultimately claimed his life. They called them the Mustache Petes. It was not, in its origins, a term of affection. It described the older generation of Sicilian and Italian mafiosi, men steeped in old-world tradition, men who wore their loyalty to the customs and hierarchies of the homeland like armor, men who believed, often rigidly, that criminal power should remain within tightly bound ethnic and bloodlines, Sicilian authority for Sicilians, honor codes inherited from villages across the Atlantic, respect earned through bloodline and tradition rather than pure business acumen. Against them stood a new generation, sometimes called the Young Turks, men like Lucky Luciano and his allies, who saw the old ways as an inefficient relic, an obstacle to the kind of streamlined, profit-driven, multi-ethnic criminal enterprise they believed the modern American underworld demanded. Joe Aiello, in almost every meaningful sense, belonged entirely to the old world. His entire identity as a criminal leader was built on Sicilian tradition, the Unione Siciliana itself, the very institution he fought and killed and eventually died for, was at its heart an old-world fraternal structure, one that had been corrupted and weaponized by organized crime but that still carried within it the DNA of the Sicilian immigrant community it had originally been built to serve. Aiello's objection to Al Capone was never simply about turf or profit margins, though those things certainly mattered. It was, at its core, an objection to the very idea that a non-Sicilian, an outsider by blood and culture, should hold sway over an institution meant to represent and protect Sicilian interests in America. This is why Aiello's alliance with the Castellammarese faction in the war against Masuria made such intuitive sense. Maranzano, too, represented that older, more traditional, more rigidly hierarchical vision of what the Mafia should be, a vision built on honor and bloodline rather than pure pragmatic efficiency. And this is also, in the end, why men like Joe Aiello were destined to lose, regardless of how many individual battles they won along the way. Because history, and certainly the specific history of American organized crime in the 20th century, was moving decisively in the other direction. Even Maranzano's eventual victory over Masuria in 1931 proved to be little more than a brief, symbolic triumph for the Old World faction. Maranzano himself, having declared himself the supreme boss of the entire American Mafia, was murdered within months of his own victory, killed on the orders of the very young Turks who had helped him win the war in the first place, Lucky Luciano chief among them, a man who had no interest in bending the knee to any single supreme boss, Old World or otherwise, and who instead engineered the creation of the Commission, a power-sharing structure that would come to define the modern American Mafia for decades to come, built explicitly around the principle that no single man, regardless of bloodline or tradition, should ever again hold absolute authority over the entire national criminal underworld. Joe Aiello, then, was not simply a man who lost a personal war against Al Capone. He was, in the broadest possible historical sense, a man who fought on the losing side of an entire generational and cultural transformation, a transformation that would ultimately sweep away the old-world Sicilian Mafia structures he had spent his entire adult life fighting to preserve and lead. Had he somehow survived his war with Capone, had he lived to see the conclusion of the Castellammarese War and Maranzano's brief ascendance, it seems almost certain that he would have found himself, within a year or two, facing exactly the same fate that claimed Maranzano himself, pushed aside, marginalized, or killed outright by a new generation of gangsters who had no patience for the old codes of honor and bloodline that had defined Aiello's entire worldview. This does not make Joe Aiello's story less significant. If anything, it makes it more so, because it captures something true and universal about the nature of power and historical change that extends far beyond the specific world of Prohibition-era organized crime. Every generation of powerful men eventually finds itself fighting a war it cannot ultimately win, not because its individual battles are lost, but because the entire world around it has shifted beneath its feet while it was busy fighting those battles. Joe Aiello spent nearly a decade locked in mortal combat with Al Capone, a war fought over control of an institution, the Unione Siciliana, whose very significance was already beginning to erode by the time either man achieved anything resembling victory. Prohibition itself, the economic engine that had made men like Aiello and Capone unimaginably wealthy and powerful, was already showing signs of political vulnerability by the late 1920s, its unpopularity growing, its repeal becoming, by the early 1930s, an increasingly foregone conclusion. The entire world that had made Joe Aiello's rise possible was already, in a sense, dying around him even as he fought to claim its throne. There is something almost unbearably poignant in this, if you allow yourself to sit with it. Joe Aiello spent his entire adult life fighting for a version of power that was already becoming obsolete by the time he finally achieved it. The presidency of the Unione Siciliana, the title he wanted so desperately that he was willing to orchestrate the deaths of 2 men to claim it, was, by the time he actually held it, already a diminishing prize, an institution whose old-world significance was being steadily eclipsed by the more Americanized, more ruthlessly pragmatic criminal structures that men like Capone, and later Luciano, were busy building. Aiello fought his entire war looking backward, defending a world that had shaped him, while his enemies, for all their own brutality and moral corruption, were at least building something oriented toward the future. And yet, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about why Joe Aiello's story still resonates nearly a century later, there is something genuinely admirable, even as we recognize its ultimate futility, in the sheer, stubborn persistence of his fight. Joe Aiello did not simply accept the tide of history sweeping past him. He did not quietly cede ground, negotiate a comfortable retirement, or fade into the background the way so many other, wiser men of his generation eventually did. He fought, with everything he had, for nearly a decade, against overwhelming odds, against an enemy with more resources, more political protection, and a far more ruthless and adaptable organizational structure than his own. He lost, in the end, in the most brutal and definitive way possible. But he lost while fighting, and there is a difference, a meaningful, human difference, between a man who is defeated because he stopped fighting and a man who is defeated because his enemies were simply, finally, able to overwhelm him. It is worth pausing here, too, to consider the broader human cost of this entire era, a cost that is easy to lose sight of when the story gets reduced to a simple tally of famous names and dramatic assassinations. Every man killed in the war between Aiello and Capone, Lombardo, Lolordo, the 7 men gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Aiello himself, and the dozens of lesser-known associates and gunmen who died in the smaller, less remembered skirmishes of this conflict, left behind families, wives, children, parents, the same kind of ordinary human grief that follows any violent death, regardless of the deceased's criminal reputation. The Castellammarese War that Aiello's death helped accelerate would ultimately claim dozens more lives across New York and beyond, a body count that historians still debate the precise total of, precisely because so many of the killings were carried out quietly, deliberately kept off official records, buried in unmarked graves or disguised as accidents or disappearances. This is the true, unglamorous cost of the world Joe Aiello inhabited and helped shape, not the cinematic violence that makes for compelling storytelling, but the accumulated weight of an entire generation of immigrant families, Sicilian and Irish and Italian alike, who came to America seeking opportunity and instead found themselves caught up in a criminal economy built on liquor and violence, an economy that consumed its own most talented and ambitious participants with a kind of grim, mechanical efficiency. Joe Aiello was, in this sense, both a perpetrator and a product of this system, a man who inflicted enormous violence on others, and a man who was, in turn, consumed by the very machine he had spent his life feeding. There is also something worth saying about the specific role that immigration itself played in shaping men like Joe Aiello, because it would be a mistake to tell this story as though it existed in a vacuum, disconnected from the broader forces reshaping American society in the early 20th century. Aiello arrived in America as a 17-year-old with essentially nothing, no wealth, no formal education to speak of, no established position in a society that, at the time, viewed Sicilian immigrants with a considerable degree of suspicion and prejudice. The legitimate paths to advancement available to a young man like Joe Aiello in early 20th century America were narrow and grueling: foundry work, factory labor, small-scale trade, the kind of backbreaking, poorly compensated work that Joe himself performed for years in Utica before ever setting foot in Chicago's underworld. Organized crime, for men in Aiello's position, offered something that legitimate American society was often unwilling or unable to provide: a path to genuine wealth, status, and power, built on skills that Sicilian immigrant communities had, in some cases, already developed back in the old country, where distrust of official authority and reliance on informal, blood-based networks of loyalty and protection had deep historical roots stretching back generations. This does not excuse the violence that men like Aiello inflicted, and it would be a grave mistake to romanticize the criminal path he chose. But it does help explain why that path proved so attractive to so many ambitious young immigrant men in that era, and why the Prohibition years in particular created such fertile ground for criminal organizations built around exactly the kind of tight ethnic loyalty and hierarchical structure that Joe Aiello embodied so completely. It is this larger context that makes Joe Aiello's story feel, even now, like more than simply another entry in the long catalogue of Prohibition-era gangland violence. His life traces, in miniature, an entire arc of American immigrant history, the desperate crossing, the grinding factory labor, the slow accumulation of ambition and resentment, the discovery of an alternative path to power through criminal enterprise, the ruthless climb, the brief taste of genuine authority, and finally, the brutal reckoning that came when the very forces he had spent his life fighting finally caught up with him. It is a story that could be told, with different details but the same essential shape, about dozens of other men who rose and fell during this same violent decade in American history. But Joe Aiello's version of that story happens to be particularly vivid, particularly well documented, and particularly dramatic in its final act, 59 bullets on a quiet Chicago street, a number so extreme that it transcends mere violence and becomes, almost despite itself, a kind of dark historical landmark. As we move toward the final chapter of this story, it's worth holding on to this fuller, more complicated picture of who Joe Aiello actually was, not simply Capone's doomed rival, not simply a footnote in someone else's more famous legend, but a man who embodied, in the most extreme and violent way imaginable, the tensions and contradictions of an entire era of American history. He was an immigrant chasing opportunity in a country that offered him very few legitimate paths to it. He was a husband and father whose domestic life was permanently entangled with, and ultimately destroyed by, his criminal ambitions. He was a defender of old-world tradition fighting a losing battle against the inexorable pull of a more modern, more ruthlessly pragmatic criminal future. And he was, above everything else, a man who simply refused to stop fighting, even when every rational calculation told him that stopping was his only real chance at survival. That refusal defined his life. It also, in the end, defined his death. And in the final chapter of this story, we will consider what that refusal ultimately meant, not just for Joe Aiello himself, but for the city he fought to control, the family he left behind, and the strange, enduring fascination that stories like his continue to hold for audiences nearly a century after the last of his 59 wounds went cold on a Chicago sidewalk. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a story once its violence has finally run its course, once the guns have gone silent and the bodies have been buried and the newspapers have moved on to whatever fresh horror the next week's headlines demanded. It is in that quiet, in the long decades after the blood has dried, that a story either fades into forgotten history or hardens into something more permanent, a legend, a cautionary tale, a fragment of the past that people keep returning to, generation after generation, trying to understand exactly what it meant. Joe Aiello's story has spent nearly a century sitting in that particular kind of quiet, and now, as we bring this account to its close, it is worth asking directly what we are actually meant to take from the life and death of the man they called the boss of the Sicilian Mafia in Prohibition-era Chicago. Let us begin where all such reckonings must begin, with the plain, unadorned facts of what Joe Aiello actually did with the years he was given. He arrived in America as a teenager with nothing, and within roughly 2 decades, he had built himself into one of the most feared and influential criminal figures in the history of Chicago's underworld, a man whose name appeared on the Chicago Crime Commission's public enemies list, a man who held, however briefly and however precariously, the presidency of an institution that once represented genuine power and authority within the Sicilian American community. By any measure of raw ambition and sheer force of will, Joe Aiello's rise was extraordinary. Few immigrants of his era, legitimate or criminal, climbed as far or as fast as he did, and fewer still did so while simultaneously waging one of the longest and most personal vendettas in the entire history of American organized crime. But ambition and rise are only half of any story worth telling, and the other half, the fall, the reckoning, the brutal arithmetic of consequences, is where Joe Aiello's story reveals its deepest and most enduring truths. Because for all his cunning, for all his persistence, for all the alliances he built and the rivals he outmaneuvered, Joe Aiello's story ultimately teaches us something uncomfortable about the nature of the world he chose to inhabit, a world in which victory is always temporary, in which every alliance carries the seed of eventual betrayal, and in which the very qualities that carry a man to the top of a criminal hierarchy are often the same qualities that guarantee he cannot hold that position for long. Aiello's relentlessness, his refusal to accept any outcome short of total victory over Al Capone, his willingness to keep fighting long after any reasonable calculation would have suggested retreat, these qualities built his empire, and these same qualities, in the end, destroyed him. There is no cleaner or more instructive illustration, in the entire history of Prohibition-era organized crime, of how the fire that makes a man dangerous is so often the same fire that eventually consumes him. And yet, it would be too simple, too easy, to reduce Joe Aiello's story to nothing more than a morality tale about the wages of criminal ambition. Because if that were all this story had to offer, it would not have survived, in fragments and footnotes and occasional dedicated research, for the better part of a century. What makes Joe Aiello's story genuinely compelling, what has kept his name alive in the historical record long after so many of his contemporaries have been entirely forgotten, is the specific, almost mythic quality of his refusal to yield. This was a man who, by any reasonable accounting, should have died multiple times before he finally did. He survived years of open warfare with an enemy who had greater resources, greater political protection, and a far more ruthless and adaptable organization. He survived the collapse of his most important alliance when the St. Valentine's Day massacre effectively destroyed Bugs Moran's North Side gang. He survived multiple periods of forced exile from his own city, hunted by an enemy whose reach stretched into police departments and political offices across Chicago. And through all of it, he kept coming back. He kept fighting. He kept reaching for the position and the recognition he believed was rightfully his, even as the cost of that pursuit mounted with each passing year, even as the men around him died one by one in the increasingly narrow circle of allies willing to stand beside him. This is the quality captured in the title we've given this story, The Boss Who Wouldn't Back Down. It is not a title that celebrates Joe Aiello's violence, or excuses the very real human cost of his criminal career, the men who died at his order or on his behalf, the families shattered by a war he helped ignite and sustain for the better part of a decade. But it is a title that recognizes something genuinely rare in the historical record of organized crime, a man who, faced with overwhelming odds and a manifestly more powerful enemy, simply refused to accept the outcome that seemed, to everyone watching, entirely inevitable. Most men in Aiello's position would have cut a deal, would have accepted a diminished share of power in exchange for their continued survival, would have quietly ceded the field to Al Capone and lived out their remaining years in comfortable, anonymous retirement. Joe Aiello chose a different path, and while that path ultimately led him to a hail of 59 bullets on a Chicago sidewalk, it also secured him a permanent, if often overlooked, place in the history of American organized crime, not as Capone's footnote, but as the one man who fought Capone longer, harder, and more persistently than anyone else who ever dared to stand against him. There is a broader lesson embedded in this story too, one that extends beyond the specific historical details of Prohibition-era Chicago and speaks to something more universal about power, ambition, and the particular tragedy of men who fight brilliantly for causes that history has already decided to leave behind. Joe Aiello was, as we discussed in the previous chapter, a defender of an old-world vision of criminal authority that was already becoming obsolete by the time he achieved the position he had fought so hard to claim. He fought his entire war looking backward, trying to preserve a structure of Sicilian bloodline authority that the more pragmatic, more ruthlessly modern criminal organizations being built around him, first by Capone, and later by men like Lucky Luciano, were already rendering irrelevant. In this sense, Joe Aiello's story is not simply the story of one gangster's rise and fall. It is a story about the particular grief of fighting a battle you cannot win, not because you lack the skill or the will to win it, but because the entire world around you has already moved on to fight a different battle altogether. There is something almost universally human in this, something that extends far beyond the specific and brutal world of organized crime, the experience of clinging to a version of the world, or a version of yourself, that the passage of time has already begun to erase, and choosing to fight for it anyway, even knowing, on some level, that the fight cannot ultimately be won. We should also take a moment, before closing this story entirely, to reflect honestly on what Joe Aiello's life cost the people around him, because it would be a disservice to his memory and to historical honesty alike to let this story end purely as a tale of stubborn, admirable defiance without reckoning with its human wreckage. Caterina Aiello spent the better part of 2 decades married to a man whose criminal ambitions eventually cost him his life, and she was left, in the aftermath, to raise 5 children essentially alone, carrying the weight of a husband's violent legacy into whatever remained of her own life. Those children, Lena, Carlo, Anthony, Catherine, and young Joseph, barely 2 years old when his father was killed, grew up in the long shadow of a father whose name was, for the rest of their lives, associated with one of the most notorious criminal feuds in American history. We do not know, from the fragmentary historical record available to us, exactly how each of them navigated that inheritance, whether they spoke of their father with pride, with shame, with grief, or with some complicated combination of all three. But it is worth remembering that behind every gangster legend, behind every dramatic tale of ambition and violence and revenge, there are ordinary human beings who did not choose the war their father or husband dragged them into, and who had to spend the rest of their lives living with its consequences. And there were, of course, all the other lives touched and ended by the war between Aiello and Capone. Antonio Lombardo, gunned down on a crowded street after his own ambitions led him into an alliance that cost him his life. Pasquale Lolordo, shot to death in his own home by men he had welcomed as friends. The 7 men killed in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, cut down while believing themselves to be facing nothing more dangerous than a routine police shakedown. The countless lesser-known gunmen, associates, and bystanders whose deaths never made the front pages but who nonetheless paid the ultimate price for a war fought over control of an institution that, within a few short years, would lose most of its original significance entirely. This is the true ledger of the world Joe Aiello inhabited and helped shape, not a simple story of one man's courage against impossible odds, but a genuinely tragic account of an entire community consumed, for the better part of a decade, by a cycle of violence that ultimately served no one's interests, not even the men who believed, at each stage, that just one more killing would finally secure them the peace and power they were fighting for. It is worth asking, too, what became of the larger world Joe Aiello fought so hard to shape, because the answer offers its own kind of closing irony to this entire story. Prohibition itself, the economic engine that had made the entire war between Aiello and Capone possible in the first place, was repealed in 1933, just 3 years after Aiello's death, rendering the vast and violent bootlegging empires both men had spent years building suddenly, almost overnight, far less lucrative and far less relevant. The Unione Siciliana, the institution at the very heart of Aiello's entire criminal career, gradually faded into obscurity as the structures of American organized crime evolved into new forms better suited to a post-prohibition economy, gambling, labor racketeering, and eventually narcotics. Rackets that had little use for the old world fraternal trappings that had once made the Unione presidency such a coveted prize. Al Capone, the man Aiello had spent nearly a decade trying to kill, spent the remainder of his own life in a slow, humiliating decline, imprisoned for years on tax charges, his health eventually ravaged by untreated illness, dying in 1947 a diminished shadow of the man who had once commanded absolute fear throughout Chicago. Even Salvatore Maranzano, the very leader Aiello had given his allegiance to and, according to some accounts, ultimately died supporting, would himself be murdered within months of declaring victory in the Castellammarese War, cut down by the very young Turks who would go on to build the modern American Mafia structure that persists, in various forms, to this day. Everyone lost, in the end. This is perhaps the truest and bleakest lesson available in the entire arc of Joe Aiello's story, and in the broader war he was swept up in. Every man who fought for supreme control of the American Mafia structure during this era, Masuria, Maranzano, Aiello himself, ultimately died violently, their ambitions outliving them only briefly before the entire landscape of American organized crime reshaped itself into something none of them had fully anticipated or controlled. Only Capone survived long enough to see his own empire crumble around him gradually, through imprisonment and illness rather than gunfire, which may in the end have been a crueler fate than the quick, brutal death that claimed his old rival. So what, finally, are we meant to carry away from the story of Joe Aiello, the boy from Bagheria, the foundry worker from Utica, the boss who built an empire out of grief and ambition and old-world loyalty, and who died in a hail of bullets on a quiet Chicago street rather than ever accept defeat at the hands of the most feared gangster in American history? Perhaps it is simply this, that history remembers, with a particular kind of respect, the men and women who refused to yield, even when yielding would have been the wiser, safer, more rational choice. Joe Aiello was not a hero. He was not, by any reasonable moral accounting, a good man. He built his power through violence, betrayal, and the deaths of former friends, and the war he waged for nearly a decade cost dozens of lives, shattered families, and accomplished, in the final analysis, remarkably little of lasting value for anyone involved, including himself. And yet there is something in his story, something in the sheer, stubborn, almost mythic persistence of his refusal to accept a lesser fate, that continues to resonate, nearly a century later, with anyone who takes the time to actually learn what happened to him. Maybe it is because most of us, in our own far less violent and far less dramatic lives, understand something of what it means to fight a battle that seems increasingly unwinnable, to watch the world shift beneath our feet while we remain committed to a cause or an ambition that everyone around us has already quietly written off as a lost cause. Joe Aiello's story, stripped of its guns and its blood and its extraordinary body count, is in some sense a story about that most universal of human experiences, the decision, made again and again, to keep fighting anyway. Most of us will never face the stakes Joe Aiello faced. Most of us will never have to weigh our own survival against our own pride, our own ambition, our own refusal to accept a diminished version of the life we set out to build. But all of us, in smaller and less bloody ways, understand something of what drove him, the particular, corrosive pain of watching someone else claim the position you believe was rightfully yours, and the fierce, sometimes self-destructive determination to reclaim it, whatever the cost. Joe Aiello paid the ultimate cost for that determination. He lies now in Riverside Cemetery in Rochester, New York, far from the Chicago streets where he built and lost everything, his grave a quiet, largely unvisited footnote in a city he never called home. But his story, the full arc of it, the immigrant boy, the grieving father, the ruthless and relentless boss, the doomed defender of an old world tradition already slipping away, and the man who was gunned down 59 times rather than ever simply give up the fight, deserves to be remembered as more than a mere footnote in Al Capone's more famous legend. It deserves to be remembered as one of the great, tragic, and genuinely dramatic sagas of America's Prohibition era, a story that captures, in the most extreme and violent terms imaginable, the ambition, the tribalism, the brutality, and the sheer stubborn refusal to yield that defined an entire generation of men fighting for control of a world that was already, even as they fought over it, beginning to disappear. That is the story of Joe Aiello, the boss who wouldn't back down. A man who crossed an ocean with nothing, built an empire out of grief and ambition, waged one of the most relentless personal wars in the history of American organized crime, and died refusing, until the very last bullet found him, to ever accept that the fight was over. If this story pulled you into the shadows of Chicago's forgotten underworld, if you found yourself holding your breath through the ambushes and the betrayals and the long, grinding war between two men who refused to let each other live in peace, then you already know what to do next. Make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more tales like this one waiting to be told, men whose names history nearly erased, whose stories deserve to be dragged back out of the dark and told properly, in full, with all the blood and all the humanity still intact. Tell us in the comments which gangster's story you want us to bring to life next, because this channel exists because of viewers like you who want the real history, not the sanitized version. The underworld never really goes quiet. It just waits for someone willing to tell its stories. And we intend to keep telling them. Thank you for walking through the shadows with us tonight. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter from the underworld we bring back to life.